Welcome to this presentation that is titled, Can Capitalism Guarantee Democracy? Every title has to be provocative, right? And I think this is good enough for that. I am Professor William Baca-Mejia from the Economics Department. I teach economics. In case you don't know me, now you have a reference. Feel free to ask questions once the presentation is over. More than happy to continue to meet with you if for some reason the idle curiosity explodes in your life about whatever we're talking today. So feel free to meet me at my office and we can discuss economic life, if that is a way to call it. All right, so we are going to express ideas around this question. It's a really hard question. There's no perfect answer to it. Some people claim that there is, but when you are truly a social scientist that is clearly spending time in thinking about these things, it is reasonable to say that there is no definite answer or here is the blueprint to answer this question. So let's dig into it. We need elements to at least come up with an explanation if capitalism possibly could improve democracy or could make possible democracy, right? But then you have to understand right away that one of the groups who claims that is the so-called Orthodox economists. In their reading, they sustain so. So we need to explore why they reach that conclusion. And then you have my favorite one, Adam Smith's reading of the market. It's not necessarily orthodox. Orthodox economists claim that they have the real and pure interpretation of Adam Smith's message. I'm talking about the potential father of economics. And orthodox economists claim that they have read Smith as everyone should read Smith. And then is the heterodox tradition. These guys obviously are going to be very critical of the orthodox view. These guys do not hate the market, right? As you may think that they do. They do not hate the market. They do not dislike the market. They just like to think that the market is not the end of the world. They seem to understand loud and clear that at some point, the economic system was based on slavery. Then it moved on to feudalism. Then it moved on to capitalism. And eventually, we'll move on to something else. Now, honest ones will tell you, we don't know exactly what is next. But it's not going to be forever capitalism. That's the Orthodox reading. And they have an understanding, a different one, of what we call the market. Finally, the heterodox reading will lead you to think that markets are not, if you have taken any economics class, you probably know that there is something called the Marshallian cross or the equilibrium of the market, right? And there is this downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping demand curve that once they are intersected, voila, we have the efficiency, right? The market has spoken. Some economists that belong to the heterodox tradition will tell you, hold on, markets are more than that. Supply and demand matter, but markets are social constructions. And you have to talk about economic and political institutions and how they interact and how they mix and how they move along and come up with whatever definition of market we have. Because without them, you cannot have accumulation. Basically, that's their argument. So we're going to go through all this today, hopefully for only 40 minutes of your life. And then we'll have, if we're lucky, a nice and enough time for Q&A, because certainly there's going to be a lot of ideas out here that should cause curiosity. So the orthodox reading of the market, right? Orthodox economists let me use a name for you. You can Google it later, like Milton Friedman. They really like to praise the market. Actually, they believe that there is something extremely powerful that is called the free market. But what they call free market actually is a freely competitive market, right? It's a market that should operate theoretically under very specific assumptions, as we learn in economics, right? It's something like there has to be a lot of buyers and a lot of sellers. There has to be similar quality among goods and services that these sellers are trying to sell us. And you are welcome to join or leave this market at any time. I mean, there are very strict assumptions. Bottom line is the perfect notion of what we understand as the free market. And they believe in that. Now, if you have taken a class in economics, this is when you start scratching your heads, right? And think immediately, well, it looks extremely beautiful on the textbook, that market that you just described. But certainly in real life, I only have 2 cable providers in my neighborhood. I only have 1 electrical company providing electricity in my neighborhood. I only see Walmart and Target dominating the retail industry up to 90% of sales. What the heck is going on? Why are you so passionate about something that doesn't match the reality? But that's precisely what makes them orthodox. They believe in that. They take that notion of market to the extreme, if you will. And I give them something, like Milton Friedman. They were very influential in the political sphere, even though they like to say that their purpose was never to influence the political agenda. But that's another slap in our faces that shows that political and economic ideas go together. Now, when you reach this beautiful free market, right, under those assumptions, and you advocate for it, make no mistake, theoretically, it's a beauty, right? If the equilibrium is supposed to happen all the time, then you're going to obtain the highest possible producer surplus and the highest possible consumer surplus. Fantastic. And there's going to be a price system that is going to signal to the point that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, and oh Lord, you cannot hate that. Right? It's just beautiful. And if we sabotage the price system, we'll be distorting the efficient signals that we must receive as buyers and sellers in order to make rational decisions. I mean, who would fight against such a theory, right? Now, if you're curious by now, go to the library after the talk or download it on the internet and read just the first chapter of Milton Friedman, Freedom to Choose. The Power of the Market, that's the title. I must give something to him and recognize something to Friedman. That's how you should write when you believe that political ideas and economic ideas go together. Give it a read. It's beautiful. It shows you that this free market does exist, even though it's a theoretical possibility. So this market is going to reach the equilibrium. Efficiency is going to happen, and out of nowhere, equity goes away. Right? And my students who are here, they scratch their heads like, okay, we're talking about being efficient. How about equitable? Right? We don't talk about that. It's like, don't talk about Bruno. We don't talk about equity, equitable opportunities and things. No. That will be later. And later is intermediate microeconomics, and in intermediate microeconomics, through sophisticated mathematical models, orthodox economists convince you that that efficiency is also equitable because you are getting what you are contributing in marginal terms. Beautiful models. Integral calculus, differential calculus. You get fascinated by it. I was fascinated by it. I was educated as an orthodox economist. Right? Can't be that elegance, right? To be able to explain a social complex problem with math. Cannot be that. It's just elegant. And then, without saying nothing about the history of the invisible hand, you are pushed to believe that because of this efficiency, of this market equilibrium, because of these very unrealistic assumptions, there's going to be an invisible hand pushing us to promote, yes, our personal interests, but at the same time, society's interests. And then, bingo, right? Social interests and private interests become one. Isn't that beautiful? Right? And this is when you say, yeah, theoretically, yeah, it's beautiful. It is. It's very elegant. The invisible hand is passed on to generations. And then you become a professor, and then you pass this on to further more generations. I mean, it's crazy. And we start to adopt and embrace that, make no mistake. The economic forces do not need political intervention. Please, do not mention the government. What are you talking about? Are you taking us towards the path of socialism? Have you read Hayek? Right? Don't you remember Friedman? What is wrong with you? Let supply and demand do their magic. And out of nowhere, we start to believe that, according to the Orthodox reading, that the harmony of interest is granted if the market is let alone. And this is powerful, because then you start to believe and embrace the idea that we do not live in a complex society. Think about the ramifications of that. There is no conflicts in societies. The market will heal them if they exist. And if you, by now, are an intermediate macro, right, grad school, then you are convinced that the economic order leads to political order. And make no mistake, capitalism, understood as free market economies, makes possible democracy. And then you just ship them to Chile under a fancy name called the Chicago Boys and try to convince a dictator that this is the way out. Right? This is how you start penetrating the political agenda. Even you want to believe that there is no need to do so because political is political and economics is economics. But their actions prove in the Orthodox reading that when they push really hard for the free market, they are pushing for this belief. Free market is going to heal any conflicts, if there is any. Free market is going to convince you that the political institutions that are democratic will emerge. Because people learn in the free market that $1 is equal to one vote, basically. I am voting when I purchase. And they will learn that, and they will embrace that even for the political spectrum as well, and voila. Once again, the harmony of interest takes place. I mean, the Orthodox reading, I always give them something. They are very logical, and they are very consistent in their reasoning. I give them that one. Nonetheless, here's the bad news for them. They have a problem. All of them, even Milton Friedman, and I'm not scared to say that, he did not read Adam Smith. He did not read John Maynard Keynes. In interviews, transcripts that exist, he recognized on the record that he never read the classics. And that's their problem. Adam Smith, the potential father of economics, is that's the one that we're going to choose. When he wrote The Wealth of Nations, obviously, that was a bestseller that became a reference worldwide, even in the 1700s, by the way. It was the book to read. But scholars who understand Adam Smith will tell you that he always told his students, the few ones he had, do not read The Wealth of Nations without reality. This is the dude that got broke twice and came back from it in the stock market. So when he talked, the monarchy said, hey, listen to Lord Keynes. And believe it or not, he's the dude who saved us. So the idea of social constructions of market, it is with us. When we talk about Social Security, you got it. It's a social construction of the market. Why? Because before Social Security, there was not even notion or discussion about retirement or savings for retirement. Once Social Security is created, bingo. Now everyone wants to talk about 401ks, IRAs, right? Everything, right? But you have to have a key player pushing the envelope. And Keynes says it has to be the government. And look what we have now. Just go visit for fun a financial advisor one day and tell them, what can I do for retirement? And they will, boy, disclose a huge portfolio. But that language will not exist if the social construction of the market couldn't have taken place in the past with Social Security. Come on, guys. Sometimes the narratives come from a social construction, and it doesn't mean that they are socialist, as Lord Keynes would say. So, seems to be clear that in the heterodox tradition, political and economic institutions are essential for the process of accumulation. Make no mistake, they are. And we recognize that when something in the political agenda is moved, it's going to offend someone else. We must recognize that, because this is a society in which conflict is just natural. It's going to happen. When a tax is levied on someone, that someone is going to complain about it. Be prepared. Now, a good managerial politician should be able to anticipate these things and try to educate. Like who? Like FDR, for instance. When Social Security was enacted, Professor Rosler probably had better experience about this, he went all over the country to tell everyone, do not worry about this, it's going to work. He did that. Gave long speeches explaining how it works. And convinced the Americans, this is not a freebie. We're putting into it. Calm down. You need that managerial skill. You need leadership. And I think in the democratic environment in the United States, that is essential. Our presidents, they pretty much spend a lot of time sitting down in their office, right? But the leadership is key. Can't say that Lincoln by himself won that war, right? The Civil War. But his leadership certainly took us there. Can't say that FDR did all this by himself, all this the social network that we have today, but his leadership did it. So you see my point? Political institutions, political ideas, when they mix together with the economic institutions, show us that there are possibilities. Share with us that the circle approach is valid. That is not what we don't have, it's what we have, and it must be redistributed without falling in the temptations of a fascist government or a socialist government. It's not about capitalism versus socialism. Even Marx, I read the 3 volumes of Marx, cover to cover. The Grundrisse, the Critique to Political Economy, the Manifesto, all of that stuff. And the only time I got to see Marx being political was in the Manifesto, and that's because Engels was actually the one who wrote that more. Marx was not. In Marx, I dare you. Come on. Formal challenge. Go to the library. Start reading it. You're not going to find a blueprint to socialism. Come on. Have fun at it. There is no such a thing. In Marx, you're not going to find that. In Keynes, you're not going to find the path to socialism like Hayek wanted to believe about Keynes. In Ricardo, you're not going to find the blueprint to socialism. You're not going to find it. Because no one knows what socialism is. No one knows. Like no one knew what capitalism was when it was brewing in the 1700s. No one knew. and we don't know how it's going to look like. We have no idea. We must be reasonable and accept that. We must understand that if we are adopting a new system, that's for sure, the new system must grant the current material prosperity or better. You find that in Marx, Keynes, and Veblen, that's for sure. You're going to find that in there, in their work. They will tell you, you want to change this? Okay, go for it. But it has to be better. And they, the three of them, recognize conflicts will emerge. It's not going to be an easy path. Someone is going to be upset about these reforms, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that we have done it. We have done it. I mean, look at the United States history, right? 240-something years of republic, and we have been told that the deficit is going to kill us, right? When we ran surplus, actually we caused booms and then depression, so I think that's not the problem. Our debt is as high as you can get it, but still we're here, right? We still chant USA, USA. So I don't know. I think I have to take the side of John Maynard Keynes and the heterodox reading that says, we have done it. We just have to stop being stubborn and be a victim of a polarization. We have to understand that social structures of accumulation need the dynamic aspects of economic institutions, political institutions, and the narratives that compose the ideology. We have to tackle those things together to actually give shape to an institutionality that creates a social structure of accumulation that brings the prosperity that we want. Because in the end, that's what we want, whether you're a socialist or not. That's what we want. Prosperity, opportunities. My final remarks, and I'm just, I think, out of time, and I want to get questions because I love questions. No one can be shy here. That we cannot be pessimistic, take that with you. And please recall that the heterodox out there, they are not radical crazy guys. I mean, this is something that was brewing since the 1800s. They understand that democracy in its simple definition is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Therefore, the people needs to be considered within any economic system because no economic system has come to reality without solid political institutions. You need the socialist structure of accumulation. And I think it's fair to take with us the heterodox note that we will run out of abundance if we run out of ideas. Can capitalism guarantee democracy? Only if it embraces the heterodox reading of the market. Knowing that one day we will stop talking about capitalism because that's life. It will evolve. And one day we will stop talking about the market. Perhaps we will never see that. It takes hundreds of years to see something like that. And with that, I will drop the mic, but I cannot do it so. But I dropped the mic. Any questions? Or you guys just woke up or something like that? If that just happened, let me tell you, it was a heck of a presentation, I think. Just kidding. Professor Rossler.
What would the tension
Yeah, Adam Smith has long chapters about class conflict, right? And I would dare to go and provide an answer saying that he will probably, if we're exploring the architecture of capitalism and democracy, he will explore the sensitivities of these class conflicts, like he did when he was talking about the guild trades, right, that dominated in Scotland and basically the United Kingdom, and how the sensitivities of having an industrial economy will push out the landlords. So I think Adam Smith will go in that direction, Professor. Like he will explore the classes. It's just the political scientists are not afraid, and historians are not afraid of talking about classes. In economics, they are afraid, especially the Orthodox, because then it destroys their principle of harmony provided by the market. But I'm quite sure that the heterodox have a lot of evidence talking about how conflictive our society is in terms of class. And I would say Adam Smith will explore it like that. That's how he will do. He will say, okay, we need capitalism, but we need it to be democratic. Like, who is going to be upset here? Who is going to win? Because someone will win, someone will lose. Economists, the orthodox ones, they love the zero-sum game, as you know. They really love that one. But Adam Smith is a recommended reading, folks. Out loud. It traumatized me when I read Smith, like my daughter says, in my head. It was traumatizing, like I couldn't understand very well. And then Robert Hale Bronner, fantastic professor, told me, read it out loud, and you will see. And I did so. Amazing. How your perspective changed.
Is there another book on Smith that you would recommend besides this Reading Incorrect?
Maurice Dobb, The Theory of Surplus Value, or The Theories of Surplus Value, fantastic summary of the message of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. It's also dense, but it's really it's a must in your libraries. Maurice Dobb. Any other questions? Come on, students.
How would you deal with the claim that, like, the New Deal, or how do you think Keynes would deal with the objection that the New Deal actually did the opposite against the war, the labor war?
Oh, beautiful question. And a good Keynesian, which are the post-Keynesian. Larry Summers, he says that he's a Keynesian, but he's clearly a Keynesian, not a post-Keynesian. A good post-Keynesian like Professor Kregel, my professor Frederick Lee, Randy Ray, like real Paul Davidson, those guys will tell you that without the New Deal, the institutional foundation will not be there to explode like it exploded in the war. Get it? We will not have that base to act as we act, because we act in a very speedy way to get us ourselves into that war. So that's how a real post-Keynesian will see it. The fake Keynesians, Larry Summers, he would say, like, oh, you got a point, yeah. It was the war, not the New Deal. But remember, we faced the war because the New Deal was there. That was a good question. I'm not scared, okay? I'm not a scary guy or anything like that.
I'm not a student, but I have a question for you. How can we have a conversation, like taking into account history and economics, to bring us towards a more favorable economy today? Like, how do we do that? Like, how can we have that conversation with people? Because what I run into is like so many ideas of we can't have universal health care because we can't afford it, despite the fact that other countries have it and are, capitalist countries. So how can we make a more productive conversation about it?
Yep. Professor Terence MacDonald, one of the excellent minds behind social structure accumulation theory, he would say, Professor Moser, that Hulu is done. Are you done with Hulu? It's time for Smith then. HBO Max doesn't cut it anymore. Maybe it's time to read Ricardo. Right? then you grab those books and you learn by yourself that the reading of the market, it's not the orthodox one, but it starts sounding like the heterodox reading. The heterodox reading, if you ask my late Professor Frederick Lee, one of the greatest professors that I could possibly have in my life, without any doubt, if you want to learn about heterodox pricing theory, you must read his book. He was very, very, very clear when he said the surplus approach is composed of a Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Thorsten Veblen, and John Maynard Keynes. All of them added a different detail to the theory, but it was always about the surplus approach. He always told us that in class. And he always says, don't ever tell your students that supply and demand do not matter. They do matter, but recall them what these guys always said. That supply and demand matter, but it also matters who is behind that supply and demand. So the power relationships are important. And now you see why heterodox are going to conclude that markets are not supply and demand like in the textbook, are supply and demand based on social construction, the social conflicts, the political rivalries, the economic conflict. It's a social construction. Whoever wins or imposes the agenda over the other sets the tone of a social construction of the market, sets a narrative, if you carefully think about it. Now, that's why heterodox believe that market as you know it. Hey, nothing against that. That is only one approach of economics, but listen to us. Markets have evolved into structures away from perfect competition. I always love doing something in my classes, and I ask my students, show me a perfectly competitive market. And my students, rightly so, look at me angry because they tell me that doesn't exist. What is wrong with you? Are you trying to fail us? Right? But you tell them, show me a monopolistic market. They immediately say, oh yeah, I got one. Colgate versus Crest, McDonald's versus Burger King and Jack in the Box, right? They immediately explode. Show me a monopoly. Oh, like a Spectrum, professor. It's amazing. The list goes on and on and on. I just shut up and listen, the beauty of the realization that we don't live in a world of a small owners or anything like that, or of this freely competitive market. It's beautiful when that happens because it confirms what Alfred Eichner in the late 1970s wrote about. We live in a world of the megacorp. That's what we live at, the megacorporation. The megacorporation realized that thing of price fluctuation, boy, that's ugly. We don't need price fluctuation. They don't like price fluctuation. It just creates uncertainty. And if you are a good capitalist, uncertainty is not good for you because then it doesn't allow you to predict and share with your shareholders how much money you're going to make them. Get it? They don't like that. And the only way to stabilize prices they came to find, Alfred Eichner says, is to gain market power. So market power is needed to stabilize such prices fluctuations and guarantee this great margin of profit for what? To fulfill the goals of the firm. That's why. You know, in recent months, we have been debating about the current inflation that the United States has, right? And a lot of people refuse to think that there is market power in the United States economy. But even my students know, because we talk sincerely about this, that the free market that the textbooks like to show us, don't get me wrong, Professor, is really neat. Just to find that equilibrium price and that equilibrium quantity is fascinating. calculate the consumer surplus and producer surplus is refreshing. But that doesn't exist. My students tell me that. So that shows you right there that everyone understands that firms have market power. And you know what was the argument, right? They said we're increasing prices because costs are increasing. And even my students, I need to quote you guys, the few of you or a lot of you who are here. Even my students said, that's baloney. That's baloney, professor, because if you're assuming perfectly competitive markets, you cannot change the price. That's the whole premise. But they are doing it. Get it? So they realize that the market as they want to sell it, the orthodox way, doesn't fly. Because if you have the capacity to respond to your cost structure, it must mean that you have pricing power. By definition. So bye-bye, orthodox reading. So, it's just really fascinating to see my students reaching those conclusions, right, after just taking one class of principles of microeconomics. For me, that is satisfying. They come and said that with market power, supply is constrained. Make no mistake about it. Go back to the example of a toilet paper. We realize that only 4 or 3 factories produce it. The baby formula, only 1 factory has the control of the market, right? Supply is clearly constrained. And the promise is, the promise always has been that we can provide the whole market at stable prices. I know I am a giant. I know I have market power, but we can provide the whole market at stable prices, so believe in us. And they don't ask you that, by the way. They ask that to whoever is in charge. They lobby to convince us about it. And there we go, right? The heterodox reading, political actions and economic actions, as much as you want to separate them, it can't be separated. Right? At least the heterodox would say that. So the heterodox reading, it's basically a challenge. It's a challenge, right, to the orthodox reading. And basically they said the challenge is to direct and control economic forces in the interest of social justice and social stability without the excesses of fascism and socialism. That's John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is considered the physician of capitalism, the dude that saves capitalism. He is a heterodox, don't get me wrong. This guy in 1923 wrote a book that is called Treatise on Money that sounds like Milton Friedman, trust me. But then in 1936, he said, I need to move on. Those theories that I thought were valid in 1923, they are no longer valid. He moved on. And he needed to act fast because the rumor was that FDR and all those leaders that had to deal with the Great Depression, they were reading Marx. They were looking at the Soviets and said, the whole Western world that embraced capitalism is falling apart, and look at the Soviets. If someone is going to defeat the Nazis, they clearly are the ones who have the shot, not us. What's happening? They started reading Marx. Keynes reportedly sent a copy of his book to FDR, basically sharing with him what I just shared with you. There is no need to go to fascism or socialism. We can save this. With what? With something that Adam Smith shared with us a long time ago. It was not a new invention. Adam Smith said it a long time ago. Just with that. Keynes continues to write heavily. This is 1926, remember? In 1923, Keynes is the orthodox of the orthodox. He is the main event in Cambridge University. I mean, John Maynard Keynes is a lord. This guy had tea with the monarchy. Just figure that. And he dared to change. He said, we need to move on from this. And start writing these things, the end of laissez-faire, right? Recognizing that the private and social interests do not coincide. Sounds familiar? Adam Smith, Karl Marx, David Ricardo, right? Now, he is a policy animal, John Maynard Keynes. He is a policy animal. He's not afraid to go and talk to the prime minister about these things. He goes on and says, define the agenda of government. And the task of politics is to devise forms of government within a democracy which shall be capable of accomplishing the agenda. Right? Keynes goes on and said, let's not argue if the way is fascist or socialist. Let's just solve the problem using political economic arguments. Now, embracing always democracy. John Maynard Keynes was very famous because he also said in one of those essays that if this is going down to a class struggle, you will find me on the side of the educated bourgeoisie, he said. Right? This guy wanted to save capitalism. Sadly, Milton Friedman and Hayek thought that he was leading us to socialism. What a terrible reading. But that's what happens when you don't read, you see? That's what happens when you don't read. So Keynes goes on, and he's not pessimistic. Right? This is the heterodox guys that is taking from the classics, Ricardo, Marx, and Smith, and Veblen, I would say, and he's trying to lead us out of this disaster that the free market caused, by the way, the Great Depression. And then he says, there is a surplus here. He doesn't talk about scarcity. He said, there is a surplus, even though we're in the middle of the Great Depression. The surplus will continue because technological change, it's brewing. Teach us. We need to do this. And if we fail to enjoy the growth of the surplus, it is because of the stubbornness of not accepting the role of government in setting the foundations to make available the amplitude of goods and services. John Maynard Keynes, I'm paraphrasing there. Please read those lines and find the connection with the climate change agenda. Everyone knows that it's coming, right? But it's still the stubbornness there. And Keynes, long time ago, said, please, we get to enjoy the surplus if we just forget about that. Of that stubbornness. In other forms, he's telling you, we gotta influence the public policy. Political ideas and economic ideas must come together because otherwise, as we know it, private interest will not match social interest. Please. Can we move on? But he's optimistic. He said, there is a surplus, and there is going to be a surplus. We just have to understand that economics and politics work together. He recognizes that the complex society matters to understand the evolving social process. He recognizes that markets are social constructions. As, Keynes is not going to be naive to say that the government is going to create this water public utility company, and voila, thousands of them will emerge. Keynes is not that silly. Right? He goes on and says the government is going to create it. Right? It's necessary for the government to create the network. It's necessary for the government to assume the capital investment, the initial one, and then a private operator under regulation will help us to match the social interest. Sounds like he has this very clear managerial mentality. Reading my theory of moral sentiments. So Orthodox now are down by 2 in the score, right? They have not read The Wealth of Nations, which they claim they got from it the theorem of invisible hand, and they have not read the theory of moral sentiments on top of that. Why is this so important? By the way, you should read it. It's a beautiful read. It's hard to read. It's all English. But I figured something out while in grad school. If you read Adam Smith out loud, it makes sense. You should do that exercise. It feels like Smith is talking to you because those books were written like lecture style. So I read both of them. And in the theory of moral sentiments, for the first time, Smith mentioned the invisible hand. But the invisible hand is not presented as a theorem, number one. It's not presented as a principle. It's not given to us as a universal law. In the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith basically explains, get ready for this, that we are not selfish, that our nature is not to be selfish. He writes like 6 chapters before he gets to mention the invisible hand, by the way, explaining to us that we are not naturally selfish, that we are self-interest, which is different. Selfishness and self-interest are two very important different things. Right? Selfishness is when you only care about yourself, as Smith is very clear about it. Self-interest is, I could make money by solving the problem of cold weather out there, providing a heating device, for instance. You're thinking about the others, but also thinking about yourself and making money, right? So there's a huge difference between self-interest and selfishness. And Smith always comes up to a point in which he talks about the impartial spectator. What is this impartial spectator in the theory of moral sentiments? It is like a burn in your heart. That's how he described it. It's like a burn in my heart that makes me feel empathy for all of you if you're going through something painful in life. And if you have empathy, you cannot be selfish. Adam Smith. That same notion of empathy is elevated, and it's more important than the so-called invisible hand. The invisible hand, dear SCC students, is the sentiment of empathy and sympathy. Adam Smith is very clear about it. You cannot make a theorem of the invisible hand when the invisible hand was mentioned only once in the Wealth of Nations and 2 in the theory of moral sentiments. Cannot do that. The Orthodox did. Lionel Robbins, mainly. Alfred Marshall, I still believe that Marshall was transitioning from political economy to what we call today economics. And then everyone freaks out at this point, right? And here's this guy telling us that Smith was not all about that so-called invisible hand. He's all about the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. So we were lied to, right? That's how probably you feel now. No, supply and demand still matter in Adam Smith. When you go to the wealth of nations, Adam Smith talked about supply and demand as you know it, but not graphically. Adam Smith just uses supply and demand, that's it. He doesn't constrain it that it's an inverse or positive relationship between prices and quantities. He doesn't go that far. He just knows that when the supply is greater than the demand, prices will tend to fall. He knows that the supply, when it's lower than the demand, prices will tend to rise. That's how he explains it. He explains it in that way. He doesn't tell you that you need the upward sloping and downward sloping curves that we use in economics. That will be Marshall, and actually that will be Lionel Robbins' interpretation of Adam Smith. Because still Alfred Marshall has this sincere academic, in this level of sincere spirit in his academic will, at least in every footnote of his Principles of Economics, Alfred Marshall recognizes that sometimes, guess what? The demand could be upward sloping. At least he has that sincerity. And recognizes that the so-called equilibrium may not happen. But Smith doesn't need any sort of mathematical functions to make this conclusion, to show that the supply, when greater than the demand, prices fall. When the supply is less than the demand, prices go increase. He also doesn't talk about the equilibrium price. Where in the world these people, Lionel Robbins, Arthur Cecil Pigot, and then Milton Friedman got the idea that there is an equilibrium price? God only knows at this point. Where did they get that from? Adam Smith talks about a natural price. The green line that you see there, or the green curve, is the actual price. It shows the fluctuations that supply and demand cause. But there's nothing called the equilibrium price. There's something called the natural price. The natural price covers the wages you pay if you are the entrepreneur or undertaker. That was the term he uses in The Wealth of Nations. You're an entrepreneur, you cover wages, you cover rents for land, you cover the rent for capital, and then the markup of profits. That will be the natural price, he said. That's like the minimum requirement in cost that you have to assume to come up with a reasonable and natural profit. If the market takes you to points in which it's above the natural price, the actual price is above the natural price, bingo, welcome to the world of excessive earnings, he said. But if the actual price takes you to a point in which it's below the natural price, welcome to the world of economic catastrophe, Adam Smith would say. There was no supply and demand as we know it in our classes. And even better, this is my favorite part of Adam Smith. Adam Smith recognizes that, yes, supply and demand exist, and it also matters who is behind the supply and who is behind the demand. So relevant for our times. And here's why. Remember the toilet paper drama during the pandemic? We just found out that only 4 factories in the United States produced toilet paper for a market of 300 and plus millions. Isn't that hilarious? You want another one? Remember the formula, the baby formula? One factory supplies the whole market of the United States and certain parts of Latin America. Isn't that funny? But when you see that, you realize right away, Smith was right. Supply and demand exist, but who controls supply, who controls demand is the key. That's the key right there. And that's why Adam Smith says, listen, because there is some sort of control. There is the political Adam Smith coming in, right? Because there is someone powerful behind sometimes the supply, behind sometimes the demand. The government has a role to play. And you cannot say that Adam Smith was a socialist. Can't say that. And when you read The Wealth of Nations, you find all of this. Read it, please. It's a wonderful book. He realizes that, that supply and demand is not going to give us all the education we need. It's not going to give us all the justice we need. It's not going to give us all the health services we need, all the military defense we need. Adam Smith said the government must step in. Just like that. And if you are not prepared for this, you think, oh my God, Smith is a socialist. Baloney, he's not. Socialism doesn't, by then, it was just, there were first writings about it, but it was not even a thing. So Smith understood that the private interest does not find enough motivation to provide goods and services that are essential for the public interest. He got it. He said, I believe in supply and demand, but someone is behind supply and demand. And that someone may not like the social interest, may not like the public interest, and goes against it. So Smith recognizes, and he describes again in his book for a moment, I thought that someone put quotes of Marx in my Adam Smith book. But it was Adam Smith. He goes on and recognizes there is conflict in this society. And he spends chapters talking about workers versus business owners. Business owners versus the public. This is a famous one because this is when he talks that whenever two businessmen get together in private, it must mean that they are conspiring against the public. Adam Smith. It's not Marx. Isn't that interesting? This is when you say, yes, of course it is. Yeah. All right? So selfishness in Adam Smith is not equal to self-interest. He destroys that argument. And he links, probably psychologists are better than this. They have done more research about this, political scientists as well. He takes us to the position that we're not fully collective when we're born, but we're not that selfish as they think. Right? Some people doom us from birth and said, oh my God, we're just savages, selfish people. That takes Smith away from those economists who think like, there's nothing we can do. People are selfish by nature. Adam Smith is not part of that club. Please do not include him in that club. And who takes notes of this? The one and only Karl Marx. The people listen to his name and they want to run. Karl Marx took note from Ricardo, and Ricardo took note from Smith. This is why Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx are considered the classics of political economy. You want to know about political economy? You must read those three guys. The three of them believe in something that is called the surplus approach. And the surplus approach is the foundation of the heterodox reading of the market. In the surplus approach, obviously, there is no scarcity. In the surplus approach, the problem is that we produce so much goods and services way above of what we need. What we need. Not what we want. We produce so much above of what we need that there is an excess, there is a surplus. Now, put yourself in the position of these three guys, right? Now, by definition, they are going to conclude that the economic problem is the distribution of that surplus. Get it? And then they start identifying who is behind the control of the surplus, and they identify interests, private ones, that goes against the public. And that's why they believe society is a society of conflict. The three of them. The three of them. Smith did it between, like I show you here, workers versus business owners versus the public. Ricardo did it between the landlords and the industrialists, right? Because that's what he got to see in his period. Marx is going to do it based on the organized labor and the capitalists. That's the name that he's going to give them. They recognize that there is always some sort of tension for this surplus. That is not about scarcity. It's about understanding that this capitalist system produces a lot, way above of our basic needs. And that's why the surplus emerged. Allow me to insist. When you read Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, which I always said to my students, please read it. Netflix is not enough for you? Grab Marx. He would say, you have to attack the ideological narratives. You have to attack them. You have to, it's a complex society, remember. It's not that we're being mean. It's just like we need to understand that we're engaging in a complex society, and we must get rid of the idea that unions are bad, universal health care, oh my God, that is socialistic, or child care, universal, we need to get rid of those ideas. We need to show them how providing those basic services, to use Adam Smith, could improve and boost even beyond our potential GDP, our potential economic growth, productivity, et cetera, et cetera. I have, in the Economic Policy Institute, there is a lot of evidence, women sharing that with a simple experiment that in some cities are running, when they have the access, only the access, okay, not it's totally free, the access to child care, how the level of productivity is skyrocketing for them. They make more money. On top of that, they are not so stressed about where the kids are or what are they doing, et cetera, et cetera. So with little pilot programs that have been run, especially in progressive cities like Boston is one of those, it has been proven that it's not that crazy. Actually, it's booming. It's the reason why the economy is booming. So that's the kind of reasoning that we have to use, Professor Grace. Like we don't need to fight at their level, right? We are not barbarians, right? We are going to embrace a democratic dialogue, make them realize, listen, the free market is not going to do it, Paul. I mean, come on. Just embrace the idea that ideology. So what do? Women stay home with the kids and that's it? And then we lose all potential earnings in our economy because that's the place they should be at because of your medieval thought? All right? So that's actually, being a liberal is not being a socialist. Let's get rid of that idea. Being a liberal is someone who lives in a society that believes in freedom, and freedom has to be affordable. Freedom has to be accessible. That's what being a liberal is. No feudalistic or anything like that. I don't know. But we don't have to be afraid of having this conversation. I have it all the time with my students. Now, I always tell them, listen, we're not talking about political process here. Political process is one thing. Professor Rosler will be the expert on that field. I will send the students your way. But it will be more about public policy. Let's talk about public policy. Please tell me why a woman cannot have access to child care. Just tell me why. Tell me why if we grant it, why is that bad? Or birth control or anything like that, right? Tell me why it's bad.
It's interesting because, like, you can see, like, when I teach my history classes, at one point, like at the beginning of the 20th century, people questioned whether you could have democracy and capitalism because they talked about business owners buying politicians and who are the politicians representing. Like, can't you even have a republic that's truly representative of the people if money is so connected to politics? And then we get into the Cold War era, and you talk about ideologies, but capitalism and democracy become equated to each other as an ideology during the Cold War. And we still have those remnants in our society.
Oh, yeah.
People thinking that communism and socialism is evil because that's like what you were brainwashed to think was propaganda during the Cold War. So like I get frustrated trying to like counteract that, and I tend to pull in other like Western countries that are successful and say they have this. Why can't we have this?
Yeah. And Grace, you probably remember this, right? Karl Marx used to say, if that is Marxism, I'm certainly not a Marxist. Karl Marx used to say things like that. Like he was against that extremism. He was always in favor of human emancipation. That was his whole idea behind it. I would say that no one knows what socialism and communism is. No one knows. People think, oh, look, it's Cuba. I just see it as a group of dictators. It's North Korea. I just see it as a dictator. It was the Soviet Union. It was a Central Planning Bureau office. It was not, you see, it was not a system, right? So that's why it's, whoever has to study the economic systems and is reflecting, with all honesty, should say that socialism and communism, we really don't know how it is or what it is or how it's going to be. We don't know. We don't know. We have all this spinning in our heads, spinning ideas, that's all. But we don't know. Now, do you think are we in the same capitalism of the 18th century? Of course not. I hope everyone tells me no. Because that 18th century capitalism was beautiful, right? It was Mr. Smith's bakery, right? Trying to sell his bread. And it was like all the hundreds of thousands Mr. Smith trying to sell the bread. Now it's one big company selling you the bread. So even within capitalism, we must recognize that these things are evolving. I have Marxist friends who said that one of the funny things that people don't realize, they need to see communism or socialism to talk about centralization. But they ignore that within capitalism, there is already centralization, right? Few companies dominating the market. I don't know. That's what.
I really like bringing in historically, like the point, because I don't think I even fully have understood that capitalism in theory, like that was originally developed, is not the capitalism that was implemented or that we have today.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that perception too. Obviously, an Orthodox economist immediately will be really, really upset with you, Professor. Like, they will be, what are you talking about? Look at Chile. And then you ask them, and how many people die? And they're like, well, that's another problem. Yeah, because they think that the political and historical aspect, just leave it aside. And historians are the ones who always make sure that the pictures of Pinochet talking to Friedman are there. Yeah, to show them like, this is not a coincidence. Even you guys who think that the political aspect is separated from the economic aspect, even there you have the two of them together, economic ideas with the political power, Pinochet and Friedman. Now, Friedman said that he never got a check from Pinochet, that's fine. But you don't have to get paid to provide advice, right? We do it all the time, right? Don't you have best friends, or you guys are selfish? Yeah, you always give away some advice to someone. Any other questions? It's the sound of the silence again. But anyway, my office is at the administrative building, soon to be called SCM 1. 2442, Office Q. Please stop by if you want to talk about this, or if you want a reading list about this. I am more than happy to provide you one. I hope that the message out there that I sent today is not that we have to be pessimistic, but that certainly, if we're going to talk about the market, let's talk about realistic about the market.